Welcome to the last Paper Zero lecture of this term. Albert Sanghoon Park will tell us about what is development. Albert is a second-year PhD student in development studies, and he knows a great deal about development, so you might pick up on some interesting new aspects of development. Welcome, Albert.
Thank you. Thank you, Alicia, and thank you to the Cambridge Society for Economic Pluralism, and particularly to the organizers of Paper Zero. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. Out of curiosity, could I just ask, how, of the people in the audience, who here is reading economics? Okay. And any development studies? Oh, all right. Oh, very nice, very nice. Okay. No, just good to know, just good to know. For this final lecture of Michaelmas term, what I wanted to do is kind of zoom out to the bigger picture. The previous lectures covered a number of controversies within economics, things like industrial policy, inequality, economic growth. But what I want to do today is to provide some context to consider these various issues in. Perhaps most important of all, though, however, I want to provide some context for you to orient your own thoughts in. Now, your mileage will vary as to how useful these contexts will be, but if you've looked at the syllabus, then you'll know that this presentation was written explicitly for those of you who strongly desire a better world. And what we're going to consider for the next 20 minutes is the history of one of the boldest endeavors to realize said better world, one that began in the 20th century and continues on today. What I refer to here is the enterprise of international development. Now, this history will be followed with some philosophy, but first let's start with the history. So we have 20 minutes to cover 70 years. So out of necessity, I'll be sticking to the highlights as we walk through time, starting with the 1940s. Now, development was and its better world was born out of the crucible of 2 world wars and 1 Great Depression. And for these 30 years when the world seemed to go mad, they did irreversible damage, or so it would seem, to many of the prevailing doctrines. Doctrines such as fascism, doctrines such as imperialism, colonialism, unhindered economic liberalism. But to think that the 1940s would entail a clean break from the past would be all too naive. After all, history is written by the victors, and here we have 2, which you can probably guess already. They're communism and capitalism. Here, fascism's faith in the metaphysics of savagery and superiority was replaced by a number of much more civilized isms. Isms of science, such as empiricism and positivism. And indeed, both Western capitalism and Soviet communism shared a faith in science as a fount of universal and objective knowledge upon which to build our better and more rational world. In development, this manifests in the will to advance economically backward areas, as they were referred to back then. This is back when it was before the politically correct terminology. And the answer would lie in injections of foreign capital and technical assistance. In other words, money and technology. Mind you, this would also encompass the fruits of social science, such as the science of administration. This too would fall under technical assistance. And to undertake this task of development would be a host of new international institutions for a new post-war world order. The Bretton Woods institutions, such as the IMF and the World Bank, founded in 1944, and the UN, founded in 1945. And in 1949, development would finally make its public debut with US President Truman's inauguration speech, also known as the Point 4 speech, in which his 4th point heralded the start of development assistance, development with clear political aims. For if we take a look at his speech, we'll see that development would function to spread the peace in that time. A peace against a tyrannical and false philosophy, to quote from the speech, with a quote-unquote totally different concept of life. Obviously, he's referring here to Soviet communism. And so the stage is set for development in the 1950s. Now, the 1950s found post-war optimism and its dreams of universal peace encountering a rude awakening with the Korean War in 1950 through 1953. This would be the first of a series of Cold War conflicts. However, faith in development continued unabated. Now, I'd like to propose three possible reasons for why that might be. First of all, economics was considered to be separable from politics. Now, this is particularly true in international institutions. For example, if you take a look at the structure of the UN, economics is a matter addressed by ECOSOC, whereas political matters was insulated within the domain of the General Assembly and the Security Council. Similarly, if you take a look at the World Bank Articles of Agreement, and this goes for pretty much the rest of the regional development banks, you will find an explicit article prohibiting political activity. That is to say, that bank activities were not to take into account political influence and to remain economic and thus impartial in their decision-making. Thus, economic development had been considered during these times as insulated to a degree from the politics of the Cold War. Now, the story for national governments, however, is a bit different. I think they knew a bit better. They didn't have to be quite so diplomatic either. And early political development theory, for example, political development theory, which isn't talked about so much these days, thrived in the 1950s and the 1960s, particularly in the US under government sponsorship at academic centers such as MIT, Harvard, and the University of Chicago. This includes a figure that some of you may very well know, the famous MIT economist Walt Whitman Rostow, who published his famous Stages of Growth, an anti-communist manifesto. And this would be his modernization theory that he would then apply in his very influential role as a national security advisor during the Vietnam War under the administrations of US Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. So this brings us to our second reason as to why the Cold War politics may not have dissuaded those pursuing development, which is that development was frankly in demand. And this is not just for the first world countries who saw development as a way of promoting peace and stability, but also for the third world countries who sought to advance the state of their peoples. One example would be the political mobilization of the third world during the 1950s for post-colonial developments with the Bandung Conference of 1955. This would be followed with the foundations of the non-aligned movement, the G77, and UNCTAD in 1964, UNCTAD being the UN Conference for Trade and Development. A second example is the emergence of alternative development strategies from the third world, or it feels a bit funny to call Latin America the third world, frankly, but we'll use the Cold War terminology. And this would be the ideas of Raúl Prebisch and the Cepalistas in Latin America, and critically the UN economist Hans Singer. They jointly considered not only the economic, but also political conditions to express their doubts about the purported fairness and benevolence of international trade. Thus, while mainstream formulations by the end of the 50s advocated exogenous injections of capital and technical assistance, money and technology, Prebisch advocated a form of sectoral targeting that became known as import substitution industrialization, a concept that you've heard of in the previous lectures. And finally, another reason as to why this continued supposed optimism for development may have continued during these Cold War occurrences can be found in the perceived success of the Marshall Plan and the recovery of the destruction within Europe. This kicked off the so-called golden era of growth, and Keynes had seemingly tamed the wolves of economic liberalism with his mixed economy models. This would go on to significantly influence the state intervention strategies of the early development economists. Thus, by the end of the 1950s, mainstream development was rather a matter of fine-tuning formulas between the balance and timing of various aid policies to maximize economic growth. And I believe you've heard about this as well, development as economic growth during this period, 1950s. So this would in turn trickle down to the masses and enable virtuous cycles of growth, equality, and democracy. Now, this might seem a bit ridiculous as viewed from the perspective of our present times, but to recall one of the common sayings from the 50s, all good things go together. This is not just a general saying, this is from the modernization theorists. All good things go together. But as we now know, with the hindsight of the present, the 1960s would prove wholly otherwise. Now, the start of the 1960s was very much a launch of this kind of ambitious development endeavor. This is heralded by the start of the first UN development decade, back then called the Development Decade, not the first of 4 as it would turn out to be. And the reason for that would be that actually it was initially proposed in 1961 by the US President John F. Kennedy. And what he had proposed in one of his famous speeches, for non-development reasons, funnily enough, is that scientific advances, again, the faith in science during this period, the 40s, 50s, and 60s, would enable 2 feats by the end of the decade. One was to put a man on the moon. So this is his famous space race speech to US Congress. The other was, does anyone happen to know, actually? The other goal for Kennedy by the end of the decade. It was the end of poverty. It was the end of poverty. And of the 2, well, you can imagine which people thought were, to be expected. I mean, so, well, as you know, one was achieved and the other, unfortunately, wasn't. So what emerged by the end of the 1960s was actually not so much a lack of growth. If you take a look at the developed and the developing countries, they had actually been doing relatively well as far as economic growth was considered. The problem was distribution, as you're aware of in terms of inequality. The rich elites in the poor countries were getting richer, but the impoverished weren't seeing the benefits. The trickle-down effect wasn't carrying through. In some cases, the poor were even getting poorer in these developing countries. So by the end of the decade, disenchantment with development was growing. And this applied too with the import substitution models in Latin America. Furthermore, economic growth did not necessarily bring democracy. And this is again referring back to that optimistic notion that all good things go together. Contrary to expectations, economic growth was all too compatible with inequality and brutal dictatorships that started rising in the 60s. But I finally want to mention another critical aspect of the 1960s, one that's often overlooked, and that is the domestic political situation, the kind of political awakening, if you will, or moral revolution amongst the youth in the developed countries. And you might ask why, if I'm speaking of development, am I bringing up the domestic politics of developed countries? But you see, by the end of the 60s, there was civil disobedience and an intergenerational crisis at hand. We had a young generation in developed countries that rejected values of the past, values that led to the US war in Vietnam, values that upheld racism, values that promoted imperialism. And I would like to posit that this discontent provides one key factor for understanding both the intellectual currents and the political changes that would come over the 70s and the 80s. Because by the 1970s, there was something of a 2-part revolution that occurred in development thought. The first was in its geopolitical contexts. In response to US intervention in the Arab-Israeli War of 1973, the oil-producing countries of OPEC severely restricted oil supplies, earning a windfall in the process. But this was an unprecedented political and economic stand by the Third World in what was very constrained Cold War contexts. This helped inspire the movement for what was known as a movement for the New International Economic Order, NIEO, in 1974, which was officially approved as a UN resolution. And as radical as this concept may seem, a new international economic order, which also raised all sorts of corollary ideas, a new information and world communication order, a new international socio-cultural order. These were ideas that were very much in vogue by the mid-1970s, and even the US State Department was not able to avoid talking about them. So this was an unprecedented stand politically, but this is also connected to the second part of this 70s revolution. This is the intellectual upheaval in development thought. Because both the mainstream external assistance and the alternative import substitution models had failed to produce development. And the end of the decade is actually marked with very depressing publications by the end of the 70s. People like Albert Hirschman, who writes, The Rise and Fall of Development Economics, or Dudley Sears and The Birth, Life, and Death of development economics. Denis Goulet and the cruel choice of development, which is, again, referring to the disillusionment of the all good things go together. Dag Hammarskjöld's the foundation releases an influential publication called What Next? That's the title, What Next? Bauer, as you may know, releases Dissent on Development, initially a speech in '79 and published in '81. And Lal publishes The Poverty of Development Economics. So this is, by and large, the end of an era, the end of the first era, if you will, for development economics. A new way, clearly a different way, was needed. And the 1970s experienced something like a veritable explosion of ideas. So you had things like the basic needs approach, things like participatory development, dependency theory, the capability approach, gender and development, sustainable development, the ethics of development. But despite the NIEO's proclamations and their grand hopes, a practical, politically feasible solution had failed to materialize. At the same time, the developed countries, and this is where that factor in the 60s comes in, were having a very unstable time, both at home and abroad. The 1973 and the 1979 oil crises only exacerbated economic stagflation. The Vietnam War had been lost. Political patience was effectively running thin. And by the end of the 1970s, you see a counter-revolution at hand, one that quickly deposed the NIEO as if it never existed and imposed stability and structural adjustment for the years ahead. So, Iron Fist is an homage to the Iron Lady, but it's here in the 1980s that we see kind of a revival of the neoclassical free market doctrine in conjunction with political stances veering towards libertarianism in a combination that is so often called neoliberalism. Political and economic instability had wrought an opposing demand for stability, one that enabled right-wing parties across Western governments in the 80s to seize control not only of political power, but by extension of the global development apparatus. And following the 1982 emerging markets debt crisis, these are the years of the infamous Washington Consensus. And I understand even the economics tripos teaches the Washington Consensus here, from asking one of the economics students. Now, this forced developing countries, particularly in Latin America and Africa, to severely curtail government controls over the economy. This included deregulation of industries, opening up markets to multinationals, this being a very, very big concern during the 70s and 80s, multinational threats. Release of currency controls, reduced tariffs against foreign imports. Governments were to stop curtailing the economic liberties of their citizens and to allow the flourishing of individual and social life through an unhindered free market. Now, this is effectively the prescription, and frankly, it doesn't sound too apolitical to me. In the context of the 1970s, this was perhaps a step in the right direction, but it was also one that grossly overshot its mark. In spite of this, however, the 1989 brought the fall of the Berlin Wall, 1991, a formal end to the Cold War, and the infamous idea of an end of history was reached, an optimal goal for all societies in development in a variety of ways to strive for, a liberal democracy with free markets. The prescriptions of the Washington Consensus were also applied in the shock policies meant to release the potentialities of repressed Soviet economies. But as we now know, the results were disastrous, and the results are very much coming to roost in the Russia that we see today. Victory, however, is a very heady brew, and development in the 1990s continued to follow in line with these liberal doctrines, not only economic but also political. So the World Bank, for all of its posturing of apolitical stances, began promoting good governance in development, and the private sector, not the state, became the new development actor. Such views, of course, found further validation with the 1997 Asian financial crisis, this referring to the newly industrialized economies, and also the lost decade of development. And I would remind you here that in the 70s and 80s, there was much paranoia about Japan being the next ruler of the world, whereas in our day, it's China. Now, not all this heterogeneity within development thought was lost in the 90s, and there was a small triumph for alternative development thought, and this would lie in the human development approach, based in UNDP. The call for an alternative and more humane development would continue, albeit in an institution that had very limited resources relative to the World Bank, and this had been the situation for decades now. A call would also emerge during this decade by those who had given up on development by now, after 4 decades of mixed results and quite a few frustrations. We also see during the 1990s the rise of a school of what's called post-development thoughts. Their call to bring an end to this whole sham that they called development. Now, on that rather dark note, we enter the 2000s. After a decade of Western, or more precisely American, triumph, the end of history gave way to science indicating wholly otherwise. Because despite the launch of the very grand UN Millennium Development Goals, the 2000s also opened up with geopolitical tremors. In the September 11th attacks, the US war on terror, failed states, and the new challenge to the global hegemon, that is the rise, or rather return, of China. And of course, we cannot forget, if we're talking about the 2000s, the global financial crisis. There is a silver lining, however. In the 2000s, we see the emergence of, the emerging markets, rising powers, the return of the rest, South-South cooperation. There emerged in the development discourse a very distinct possibility for a multipolar world. Finally, a more democratic one on an international scale, which had been the struggle for decades now, since the end of World War II. However, there are 2 concerns that I would raise in this regard. And one is whether such a shift towards a more democratic, a more equitable situation in geopolitical relations can be peacefully and sustainably achieved. And second, connecting to the first, is the concern that the present gridlock in international organizations does not inspire much faith as to the possibilities of institutional adaptation in the original development institutions that had been founded in the 1940s. That being said, the opportunity is, however, there. So what can we learn after looking at 70 years now of development history? What can we see? Well, for one, development is clearly not as simple nor as innocent as it may sometimes seem to be. Yes, it is about, building a better world. It's about going out there and improving lives, helping each other. However, if there's one thing to learn from development's history, it's that there's a plurality of ways to do so, and each with very mixed results. Furthermore, I hope this history helps you appreciate that development, which is still most popularly recognized as economic development, is a politically entrenched endeavor. Politics and political context are inextricable from all of development. This present political gridlock in international relations is still very much relevant for international development. But politics is not just about constraints, and politics does at times get a very bad rap. I'd like to argue that a recognition of the importance of politics within development, a recognition of the importance of political development theory, which has by and large faded over the last few decades, is very important to recognize the sense in which politics is very integral in the process of achieving development. Politics in the sense of politics as the art of the possible. Not politics as in the constraints against all these ideas that do not take into account political realities. So if one would wish to make a positive and practical impact in the world, whether through economics or development, then the argument here is that one best pay attention to politics. And I particularly emphasize this to you as students of economics and students of development, because there are some that may say that you can ignore politics. But if you're in economics, and even more so if you're in development, and as much as it is in social life, politics will never ignore you. So, an inescapable factor. So then, what is development? We've spent 20 minutes going over a descriptive account of how we have to define development. But let's now, for the remaining time, switch to a more normative perspective. The rather controversial question of how should we define development? In particular, I want to focus on one key aspect highlighted by this history of development, and that is the plurality in the politics of development. That is, how are we to define development amidst this plurality of definitions, this plurality of better worlds? Whose ideas matter? Whose knowledge counts? And what are we to do when our better worlds, when your better worlds, when my better worlds, when the peoples outside come to collide? And I'd like to present three broad approaches that attempt to answer this question within development theory. The first being, universalism, value universalism. So here we'll take the stance that there exists universal values and that there are reliable ways of arriving at them. This is a fairly intuitive notion. I mean, who here, raise your hands if you would reject love or freedom or justice. I don't think there's, okay, fair enough. Who here would otherwise deny kind of food, shelter, health, education? And it's because such universal values exist that we can say that there is a basis for universally legitimate development action. Yes, there may be cultural and historical differences, but this is a matter of more translating and implementing around these differences. It's not a matter of questioning the fundamental values of development. So voila, you have a clear path for action. Many different ways to go about it, of course, but the fundamentals, the values of development remain the same, and these are the universal values to be found across humanity. But I'd also like to play devil's advocate and ask, well, does this really hold? Has this really held in development history, for that matter? And what we see are the emergence of three sorts of problems. One, the first that I would call kind of this problem of ignorance, and that is that some proponents of universalism would seem to confound their particular visions of universalism as truly universal ones. So, in other words, you may think that your views are universal, but I may beg to differ. Thus, you have the cries of anthropology, geography, who argue against this false universalism of economics. You have those who argue against early development theories, which reduced human civilization to kind of these linear stages of growth. You have those who argue against human rights, because of the various different interpretations, the various different meanings. And the fact of the matter is, if we take an uncritical insistence on forcing our particular views of what ought to be universal, it very quickly turns into a road that leads to disaster. And frankly, the 21st century already holds testament to this, unfortunately. The second problem of universalism is the problem of access. And that is the fact that these values, however universal, do not exist in isolation. They are embedded within value systems, if you will. So even if there are universally held values, the attempt to uphold certain values and to prioritize them over others, or the presumption that you can handle certain values in isolation and not have to deal with the rest of the values characterizing a society, may be wholly politically unfeasible. And finally, even if such universal values were to exist and were to be accessible on their own, we're still left with the question of, is it enough? Do we have enough in common humankind to be able to have universal development action beyond just bare basic needs? Is it enough to help promote the kind of developments that developing people might ask for? An example for this might be, for example, economic growth in the 50s and the 60s. This was kind of a universal value, but was it sufficient? Well, clearly, it seemed otherwise. The same thing is true today with this faith in the free markets as a sort of panacea for all sorts of assorted development problems. There are clear signs of this as well not being enough for development either. So then let us consider a second option found within development, and that is the stance of value relativism. This is an approach much more favored by the critics of development, or those who are more critical within development. Universalism, it's much more ubiquitous within mainstream development thought. It is much more practicable for that matter. But first of all, we might say here that values are relative, basically, to time and or place. In addition, methods for arriving at these values might be relative as well. And so thus these notions of universal development are actually illegitimate. And the benefit of taking this stance and the way it's used within development theory is that it acknowledges the human diversity that is so often lost in the focus on universal approaches. In doing so, it leads to arguments that also espouse for kind of a democratic empowerment. So you see arguments for grassroots approaches, participatory development. The focus is not on this kind of dictatorial top-down approach, but rather a more bottoms-up endeavor. However, relativism also falls into its own fair share of flaws. So if we think this through, we might think of two problems, at least within developments, that emerge. And the first is the problem of polemics. Now, this may not be so much a problem with theory, but more with the writers themselves. But frankly, the arguments for relativism within development verge on the polemical. It's not just that bad development theory is thrown out. Quite often, the entire development endeavor itself is thrown out. And thus, kind of, you see this throwing out the baby with the bathwater phenomenon. Secondly, there's a problem of practicality. And what I mean by that is that relativism is a very, very powerful tool for critique. But it often fails to posit practical alternatives. And curiously enough, many of those who adopt these kinds of relativist strategies in arguing against mainstream refuse to produce practical alternatives. So it is rather more preoccupied with deconstructing the mainstream discourses than constructing another one of its own. And in that sense, you might be able to actually demean some of these relativist arguments as somewhat parasitic, in the sense that without any subject for these relativist arguments to attack, then they fail to stand on their own. So it seems that universalism brings up some good points, but has its fair share of failures. Relativism, in reaction to universalism, highlights a lot of the shortcomings of universalism, but then falls short of its own impracticality and its kind of self-annihilating criticism. So is there another option? And to this, I'd like to propose something that's very appropriate for this seminar today, and that's pluralism. So, pluralism seems to strike this kind of diplomatic sort of compromise between universalism and relativism, and it preserves the possibility of an answer, as with universalism, while recognizing at the same time differences, the possibility of a plurality of answers. Multiple value sets can exist, and that's okay. And this is kind of a nod to the relativist arguments. Multiple value sets, multiple modernities, multiple ways of life, multiple ideas of progress. They all ought to coexist, because coexistence, especially in our world today, is endangered when two rights must necessarily entail that one is wrong. Such conditions foster a sort of tyranny of reason, and quite often against our better senses. But at the same time, if we also take a critical look at pluralism as well, you run into some problems here. First of all, it's kind of a problem of ambiguity. Pluralism sounds too good and often too vague to be true. Or maybe it sounds rather obvious, a pragmatic approach that is already in place. So there is some problem here in the sense that pluralism, whether it be in development or in economics, can mean any number of stances crossing domains of ontology, epistemology, ethics, and otherwise. And to this, I also want to add the problem of constraint, which is, where does pluralism draw the line? Where does it start breaking down into relativism and pluralizing beyond control, and when does it become a cover for universalism? Perhaps universalism and relativism are actually more convincing points after all, more convincing arguments. Because you can call, for example, for a movement to let 100 flowers bloom, but the political realities of a constrained attention space mean that such circumstances often lead to counter-reactions. And if we look at history, we see this in the 1970s with the kind of explosion of development thought and the kind of counter-reactions. We see this in the 1950s in China, where Mao was the actual one who invoked the saying. And you can see this even in the 1920s in Soviet Russia, when you had very innovative economists, what are commonly argued as, unfortunately not that commonly, but sometimes argued as some of the very early development economists who came to meet very grim political fates. So if pluralism is to provide a different way, an alternative solution, then it's going to need to take particular care to enunciate the philosophical premises that it entails. But after all this talk, I cannot say, not yet at least, that any of these three approaches offer a clear answer. Rather, what I hope to do by presenting these three approaches is to at least initially help frame your consideration of the various perspectives taken or the various strategies taken to build development theory. I'd also like to think that it highlights the philosophical quandaries invoked in development, because the philosophical weight of the notion of development, the talk of a better world, is very often lightly tossed around in our days. The talk of development, of improving lives, but to actually do so in practice, to actually commit oneself to the act, is a much weightier affair. So what philosophy can do, and the reason I bring up philosophy for the second part of this lecture, is that for development it can endow a critical eye, one which can clearly outline some of the deep-rooted dilemmas that keep on reappearing in development history, one that can help discriminate between the rhetoric and the reason that is so often found in development, and one that can help overcome, perhaps of relevance to all of you, the boundaries that are placed between individual, disciplinary, and otherwise cultural thought. I believe this is actually what many of the original pioneering development economists ended up trying to do. People like Albert Hirschman, Dudley Sears, Gunnar Myrdal. But perhaps they never had the chance, after the demise of development economics, which is when a lot of these reflections started to emerge, to try to change things, and at least in immediate consequential ways. That being said, perhaps we, on the other hand, are in a position to do so. So what lessons have we learned from this history and philosophy of development? Well, now we can start talking about the philosophical nature of development, because now we can realize that building a better world sometimes results in the dilemma of dismantling others, because doing development entails intervening upon others' lives, intervening within other moral environments, and because the world that we live in today is still very much characterized by diversity in views, in worldviews and perceptions of existence, systems of faith, forms of life, whatever you want to call it. And because international development ultimately aims to bring social progress over this diversity, it will inevitably have to come to face these philosophical problems. Thus, philosophy too is inextricable from development. For despite these kind of feel-good images associated with development and the noble mission of improving lives, the reality is much less ideal. And after 70 years of trying, it would be naive to think otherwise. Frankly, it'd be more than naive, it would be ignorant, and more than ignorant, especially in our present political climate, it would be dangerous. After all, the conflicting worlds that you find in development are very much mirrored by the other conflicting worlds that we see today, the ones that we find between economics and anthropologists, between the World Bank and the UNDP, between the US and Russia or China, between Islam and the West. And at this point, some may be a bit alarmed and say, well, you started off talking about development. How have we started talking about geopolitics? How have we started talking about philosophy of social science? You might think that I'm thinking too big, that I'm overinflating the domain of development. I'm blurring all these boundaries that I should not disturb. And to this, I would say you're absolutely right. I am disturbing these boundaries because, frankly, I might say in response that others are thinking too small about development. Because development is not just about growth or education or aid or basic needs or minimum supplies. Even if you start in these limited contexts, once you start going into the practical realities, you run into the political and cultural realities of practice. It kind of reminds me, there's this Yogi Berra quote that says, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. So kind of these limitations of the various theoretical perspectives that keep on appearing. After all, development is just another word for progress And in the name of development, many ideas have been released into the world. So it's high time that we take a more critical look at the realities of development, especially after 70 years. It's very much a part of our history to understand the ethical implications of development and also to confront the ethical and very challenging dilemmas that it entails. What I'm saying is that this is not to say that we should abandon development, far from it, but it is merely to say that if we wish to improve the present situation, whether it be in development or abroad in the wider world, it's usually wiser to try to understand it first. And the understanding has been, unfortunately, in my view, sorely lacking. So as we move further into this 21st century of ours, I have to admit I have very strong feelings that delving into the history and philosophy for practical purposes is less of this abstract luxury and frankly much more of a practical necessity. As Isaiah Berlin once, philosophical concepts nurtured in the stillness of a professor's study could still destroy a civilization. This is referring more to the kind of Kantian sword that so enlivens these objective values of, German civilization at the time, 1800s. But this also refers to the many different kinds of fundamentalisms that we find today in development and outside. Those of fascism, those of free markets, those of state authority, those of religion, but also for those too of science. And in an age where our lives are increasingly interconnected, so too are the dangers of clinging to such absolutes. Epistemological arrogance of this sort, conscious or not, breeds intolerance, and this sort of intolerance breeds conflict of the more vicious kind. So, as a wise being once said, I think it's very pertinent for our times as much as it was for the 70s and 80s, only the Sith speak in absolutes. So that is all that I want to say. I'd like to end on as positive a note as I'll get. So at this point, I guess the remaining time is open for questions and answers. Sorry?
Do you want to take the questions yourself?
I guess up to you, but let me just get a pen, sorry.
Is there any question? Yes, there is. Albert, there is questions.
Oh, no. Why? Yes, please.
How difficult do you think it was to convince, for like the free market idea to convince the developing countries to adopt? It seems like something that no one would really want. So I wonder how easy it was, or was it just one of those, just using the leverage they had with aid and all that? But was this something, because sometimes I read that it was supposed to be an idea that would actually improve and help. It wasn't like you have to do this because it was something that would actually help you prosper. But it turned out not to work. But what do you think?
How difficult it would be to
convince a developing country that, hey, do this?
Well, if you have the intellectual foundations that they may not have, then you can make a very reasonable argument for it. And this is not to say that necessarily there were always times when the free market was coerced or forced upon developing countries. I think there are plenty of cases where developing countries took upon free market policies of their own volition. But there is also, and this again is the benefits of understanding the politics behind it, it's also a bit of a game, frankly. Because the developing countries also have to kind of cater to developed country desires, and if free market is the way to go, then free market is the way that you will go. Of course, you will do your own things by the side if you're smart about it, and by and large, I would argue that this is kind of what happens in development today. You meet all the demands, you say, I'll word this in terms of private sector development, I'll word this in terms of, rural poverty reduction plans, but what you actually do on the ground, however, can be very much otherwise. So there is still this kind of flexibility, but back in the 80s, it was a much more tight, kind of constrained space, because frankly, at this time during the bailouts of the emerging countries, they weren't offered access to loan facilities outside of, or many of them outside the World Bank, because they had already gone out ahead of time to prevent these developing countries from accessing them. So the World Bank was the only place to go. It was the only game in town, which is partly why the present situation in development today is turning out to be quite interesting, kind of the new Developments Bank, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, these kinds of movements.
I wanted to ask you a question about, so recently we've seen criticism of especially GDP as a measure of economic growth and economic development. You've seen the emergence of happiness reports, happiness indexes, the OECD Better Life Index. Do you think this is something welcome? Obviously, economic growth is usually incorporated in these, not the happiness index. Which leads me also to a wider question. If you look at concepts of development that measures development based on the material base of society, right? GDP growth, technological change, productivity growth, industrialization versus non-material. More talking about human rights, democracy, and so on. You would probably say both should be emphasized. Do you see any causal connection there? One leads to the other. Could sort of improvements in the material base of society lead to other types of freedoms, and which type of development?
Yes, very much so, very much so. But do you believe in happiness? So I'm a bit of a skeptic when it comes to all this kind of gross national happiness. We're all going to. It's a very nice notion, but again, I'm very much someone who's thinking about the political realities of the situation. Is it really going to change things? And is happiness really going to be the answer? So I have my fair share of skepticism on the happiness front, but as to the connections, yes, there are definitely connections, but there's one thing that I would like to argue has been very much missing in terms of understanding these connections and in realizing the connections between kind of material and immaterial progress. And that is the human will. I realize this probably sounds a bit funny, but there's a very interesting paper written in Foreign Affairs by Isaiah Berlin called The Bent Twig. And this goes along with this whole analogy that nothing straight hath grown from the crooked timbers of humanity. Not everything is as orderly and straight and logical as it may seem. But what he refers to by the bent twig is the political realities in which a human and a culture, for that matter, is not easily broken. And you may think that you may have broken them or that you may have controlled them. But a lot of these kinds of external interventions into domestic affairs have produced situations where you have something where human souls or human wills are a bit like a bent twig, and this is an analogy. And the more you refuse to recognize these domestic wills, these domestic desires, and the more you impress what you think ought to be done as opposed to them, the more you pull back on this kind of bent twig of sorts, and the faster and the more vicious it'll lash back when it is released. You can obviously kind of imagine the analogy I'm making to our present day. But this is an aspect of development that is very politically controversial to go into. And so Sen and the capabilities approach have kind of made a step towards this by recognizing the importance of recognizing individual agency, this kinds of will, as to some extent, you could argue, an aspect of well-being. It's not necessarily happiness, but purpose, desire. It's control, if you will. But to go towards from the individual to the social aspect of kind of self-determination becomes, from a political standpoint, especially from donor country standpoints, and especially with developing countries that may or may not be very controversial, because obviously political controversy still to this day very much affects allocations of development aid. It's not such an attractive idea. this notion of kind of individual expression, social will as a measure of development. I can't really imagine it today, not in our present climate, but it's one that's been suppressed for a long time. And yes, well, I won't say anything further.
Time for one last question.
Maybe you can both ask and then I'll try to combine.
Okay, perfect.
Sure, so mine's sort of a two-part question. I think they interrelate and you can decide whether you want to answer them separately together. The first is, at the end of your presentation, you said you don't want to abandon development and the idea of development. And I was wondering why you wouldn't want to do that. I mean, you have this sort of, what I think is a healthy skepticism towards a whole lot of things, but then you kind of want to maintain development and sort of reform it. And I was wondering if the historical roots of development are such that it is impossible to reform it in ways that you might think are viable, pluralistically or whatever, why would you want to hold on to the concept? So that was the first question. And then the second one is another thing you said right at the end. You mentioned building a better world entails dismantling others and the ways that other people live and so on. When I heard you say that, it sounded as if you were saying, well, people's worldviews are rooted in their experiences and their religions and all of these things, and it came across as being in the developing world, that those people out there in those other countries need to change their ways of doing and living so that they could be more developed. My question there is, given the power configurations, ingredients, saying whatever, why would you not target that towards the people who are doing the development, the first world and so on, and say they're the ones who have to change their perception of the world and change their way of being in the world and so on. So the UK needs to develop itself or change itself so that the rest of the world has a better chance.
Fortunately, that was a very concise question, so the other one equally concise, please.
Okay, I'll be very short. So thank you very much. Very comprehensive. Fantastic. Terrific. Just wanted to challenge you a little bit.
Yes.
Because I think it's impossible to disagree with you. You've taken a very safe, holistic, fantastic approach to an overview of history of development. Now, coming from the world of practice, I would say, well, it's just plurality, and many people in practice will tell you, well, I think the world we're describing as the World Bank or the criticisms about dogmatism is already 15, 20 years old, and things have changed. There has been a lot of embracing of plurality. Now, we may argue that they're ticking boxes, but is it a situation where academia and theory might be lagging behind practice? And if it is the case, since you are pursuing a PhD, what is it new in what you bring up this notion of plurality, other than a safe approach to development definitions?
Okay, and one even briefer introduction
yes,
from
right.
upstairs, please.
Hello. Hello. It's more about trying to understand this kind of genealogy of these 70 years of development.
Yes.
More than discussing, because I think we don't have enough time in general. Why didn't you include colonial studies, human rights, and sustainable development? You, for example, during the history part, you included specifically MDGs, for example, which is something very specific. I would like to know why these three concepts, that they don't have an important part in your history section.
Thanks. Okay. You have 2 sentences to answer all 5 questions.
I didn't have time. Sorry. I agree on the in terms of which way the information flows. I'm also going to say the developing distinction makes no sense to me. It may have made sense to some extent back when decolonization was still happening, before it happened, but in our present day, it doesn't make sense to me. I don't think it really makes sense. So that's that. Impossible. Why not abandon development? Why am I still clinging on to the idea? Because I'm human. And I don't think that it's impossible to reform. And I think the desire for better is an incredibly important one, and it's not one that you can just simply lobotomize out of your brain. It's a fundamental desire. It's kind of one of my favorite quotes. Human history is the product of discontent. It's very much a driver of progress. And as to the final, is theory lacking practice? Yes. And what do I hope? To produce some of the philosophical foundations and to address some of the deep-rooted theoretical problems that have never been properly paid attention to. At least not in my archive search, not in my literature reviews. I haven't been able to find it yet. Basis for legitimacy in the global context we live in today. I haven't seen it.
So before thanking Albert for his very nice answers and nice presentation, I'd like to remind you that there is an event on Thursday at 5 o'clock in the Little Hall, a presentation of a book called How on Earth? Welcome to the Post-Growth and Not-for-Profit World. And it's a very new concept presented by the lovely Jennifer Hinton. Please come and join us and join me in thanking Albert once again.